Good morning, everyone, and welcome to you all. I can see you're literally all around the world, so it's a joy to have you all here this morning. After Jim speaks, we will have a brief question and answer period. So I'm inviting you to put your questions in the chat. Just put a Q and then your question. And after his talk, we're going to just look at the Q list and we will go first come, first served. And we request that you keep your question brief so more people will be able to participate. And at the end of the session, we will be moved automatically from room to room. Now I have the great pleasure to welcome Jim to our conference virtually. Welcome, Jim. It's good to see your face here this morning. And I want to explain that during Jim's lifetime, he has produced an incredibly rich body of work. And if you talk to Jim, he's always very, very relaxed, and he really diminishes what he's done. He's very humble about it. And he explained to me once that, you know, it was really just serendipitous that he ended up in this whole field of language acquisition, ESL, bilingualism, and multiculturalism. But his impact since he graduated from the University of Alberta in 1974 has really been tremendous, because most ESL teachers globally have at one point or another read his work. From his early contribution to the concept of BICS, Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills, and CALP, Cognitive Academic Linguistic Proficiency, in 1979, to his recent publication, Big Ideas, Jim has always kept the student learner, at the very heart and core of his work. He's also been an academic who has always re-entered the classroom and schools. He's not an academic sitting in the ivory tower just cranking out all this prodigious amount of work, but he's been in classrooms, he's been observing, and he's been an active participant. And he's been a tireless advocate for English language learners globally, from Nunavut in Canada to the Maoris in New Zealand to Spanish speakers in California. Jim has been a tireless voice for those students. He also has created an incredible body of work. I just recently looked at his website, where only part of his output is actually recorded. More than a dozen books in a 10-year period, more than 45 chapters to texts. So even though he's always been very prolific and very exacting, the student remains at the heart and soul of his research and concern. Jim, it's a pleasure to have you here, and I will ask you to take over the mic. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne. It's great to see you. It's also great to see Martha. I know Martha from her time at OISE quite a few years ago. And Suzanne and I talked about this conference probably for the last at least year and a half. And I was looking forward to being able to spend some time in Newfoundland. But at this stage, I'm very happy to be able to see a part of Newfoundland behind Suzanne's face, and I can see what I'm missing. But thank you for that really generous introduction, Suzanne. It's also great for me to be here. I'm going to go and share my screen at this point, so it may just take a couple of minutes to set up. Okay. So what I want to talk about is basically the same kinds of things that we saw and heard in the video that started off the conference, which I thought was phenomenally done and really informative. And as I said in a comment in the chat box, I hope other TESL educators and educators generally across Canada get to see it and hear it, because there was a lot of wisdom, a lot of really good ideas, and a lot of the attitude that I think we need to inculcate across not just TESL teachers across Canada, but all teachers, an attitude of generosity and welcoming, and looking at the assets and resources that students and families bring to their new society. So that was, for me, a phenomenal way to start and get into the mood of the conference. But I want to look at the same kinds of issues, but from a somewhat different perspective. As Suzanne mentioned, I've been involved in research relating to these issues. And the issue of how research relates to practice is one that arises often when we look at how policymakers and ministries of education make policy. And often we've got a certain impatience on the part of teachers and educators who are working face-to-face with students, with what they sometimes perceive as people in the ivory tower, kind of pontificating about what should be happening without actually being there and doing it. Suzanne mentioned that I'm not an ivory tower academic. I haven't been able to get into the ivory tower for the last 6 to 8 months because it's been shut. But I retired about 6 years ago. And so my involvement with actual research has been a little bit less during that time. But what I've been trying to do is pull things together in a way that that makes sense, both for me and for teachers that I've worked with. And over the last 20, 25 years or so, virtually all the research that I've done has focused on working with teachers. And one of the themes that comes out of that has been that teachers are knowledge generators. And in a context which is complex, in a context where there are challenges that nobody has learned how to deal with in teachers college or in professional development, because these are new challenges. Teachers have got to have the freedom to innovate. School principals have got to be aware that as a school, we are a learning community, and we need to share the insights and knowledge that we develop from doing. And one aspect of that is, okay, what is the research saying about these issues? What do we know from our research that's taking place in Canada and other places that we can apply to our situation? And so the first part of what I'm going to talk about is just what the research actually says. Okay, I'll give you an overview first in terms of where I want to go, kind of a map of the presentation. So the first part looks at what we can learn from research. And one point is that I think as was mentioned in the video, conversational and academic language vary considerably, and they've got different acquisition trajectories. And if we don't know about those trajectories and the different time periods that are typically involved for students to acquire everyday interpersonal communicative skills, as opposed to catching up academically, we can make inappropriate and problematic judgments about students. For example, think that they might have some special education need, when in actual fact, they're just following the normal trajectory. And what we know from research from a lot of contexts is it typically takes English language learners at least 5 years, and often much longer, to catch up academically. Another point that is often misunderstood is the role of students' first language in their acquisition of the second language. We often think, well, if that first language wasn't there, then these students wouldn't have these problems. And in actual fact, the first language is the foundation upon which students build their second language. And we should never suggest to parents that they try to switch to English in the home, because that's parents probably do not have fluency in English. The quality of communication in the home is likely to drop if parents try and do that. And so we need to understand the relationships between the two languages. Another point that again was made by a couple of people in the video was that getting students actively engaged with text, helping students to read extensively is crucial. We find academic language primarily in print, and so access to an active engagement with print makes a huge difference. And we sometimes don't think of that as part of the kind of ESL toolkit. And often in schools, classroom teachers are not really familiar with just how crucial it is to get students engaged with print, and particularly in an age where video games and social media and other kinds of engagements and distractions are prominent in children's lives. Books kind of get put off to the sidelines. And so what I want to emphasize is that we need to build up a connection between students and books and print generally from the day they walk into school. And the final point that I want to kind of highlight in terms of identity issue, in terms of research, is that there's a huge amount of research. Most of it is qualitative research, so it often gets ignored by policymakers. But there's a huge amount of research that issues related to identity matter. Students learning the school language are often vulnerable for a variety of reasons. And sometimes there's rejection and devaluation of immigrant communities in the wider society. Sometimes the welcome mat is not laid out in the ways that we might hope for. And so in order for students to engage confidently with learning, the school needs to connect to students' lives and affirm their identities. And again, that point was made repeatedly in the video using like somewhat different language, but the point is the same. And then a second aspect, which I'll just briefly touch on in the presentation, is how can we use online learning or hybrid online plus classroom learning to our advantage? This is likely to be an ongoing issue for certainly the next year or so, and we may go up and down in terms of the degree of vulnerability with respect to this virus and other ones that may come along later. But I'd like to just highlight just two examples that I've been involved in. One is a system, a set of tools that goes under the name Binogi. You can check it out and explore it at binogi.com. It's online animated learning modules covering much of the science and math curriculum between grades 5 and 10. It covers a lot of other aspects of the curriculum also, but there's a strong focus on science and math. And these are engaging for students. They're probably too compressed for students to look at on their own, but as something that we can use in our online learning, I think they have an important role. And I've been involved in some research in the Toronto area with colleagues relating to that. And then there are quite a few of these modules that are freely available either through Binogi or through YouTube. And then for secondary students, there are free resources such as TED Talks that have subtitles and transcripts available in multiple languages. And if we can get students to find TED Talks, or if we can help them find TED Talks that focus on things that they're interested in, that can be a really good way of exposing children to audio, to text, with the built-in support of their first languages. Depending on the time, I'll get into those issues in the second part of the talk. So let me go through a lot of this fairly quickly. You will have access to the PowerPoint after the conference. Denise said she would email it to everybody, as well as a short paper that covers some of the same issues. So the first point I want to make in terms of what the research is saying is that there are different realities when it comes to everyday conversational fluency as opposed to what we do in schools, and then challenges that students have in picking up the kind of language that's built into the different disciplines. In face-to-face situations, as all of us know, a lot of the meaning is conveyed not just by the language, but also by gestures, by the immediate context, by facial expressions, etc. We're talking about the kind of language that the vast majority of native speakers of any language acquire by the time they enter school around about age 5. But we're talking also about a thin sliver of the language. We're talking about the use of high frequency words and simple grammatical constructions. And students learning the school language typically require 1 to 2 years to attain reasonable fluency in this kind of situation. It'll vary, obviously, there will be considerable variation depending on how much exposure children have to the language, but those are ballpark figures. When we look at academic language proficiency, we're looking at a very different kind of animal. We're talking about knowledge of less frequent vocabulary, the kind of language that we don't find in everyday conversation, as well as the ability to interpret and produce increasingly complex written language. If you look at the curriculum expectations, for example, in Newfoundland or any other province for, say, grade 10, grade 11, and compared to grade 1 or grade 2, you can see the gap that's there. We're talking about frequent use of passive voice and nominalization. A word like acceleration, where we make a noun, an abstract noun out of a verb or adjective. And again, we rarely use these in conversation. And the crucial point here is when we understand these differences, we know that academic language is found primarily in books and printed texts. And so extensive reading is crucial in enabling students to catch up. And I'll talk about that research in a little while. Just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, this is a selection of vocabulary that I pulled out of a social studies unit. It was an American textbook, and this was a unit on the American Revolution. Now, if you think about the last time when you're talking with your friends or family members that you used a word like perpetual or preamble or annexation or amend, you can see that there's a major difference here. Anybody who uses this kind of language on a regular basis is likely to be defriended very quickly from Facebook. They probably will not have very many friends generally if this is the kind of language they use. So there's a big difference between what we use in our everyday lives and the kinds of language demands in school. This may be a diagram that some of you are familiar with. It's based on some of the work that Isabel Beck and colleagues have done, where they distinguish between 3 different kinds of vocabulary. Tier 1 is the most extensive group, and these are high frequency words used in everyday conversation. Tier 2 are general academic vocabulary found in academic texts across the curriculum. So these might be words like explain, investigate, etc., that will occur across science, across social studies, across other areas. And then tier 3 is the low frequency specialized academic vocabulary that will typically be specific to a particular subject. So in science, you might have words like photosynthesis, etc., that we're not going to use when we're talking about the football game that we just saw. So the implication of this is that students will often very quickly get tier 1 words in their everyday interaction. But at the school level, we need to make sure that we reinforce their knowledge of particularly tier 2 words, which are the most high utility words for academic purposes. And then we teach low frequency specialized vocabulary in the context of different subject matter or disciplines. One of the other pieces of research that I mentioned was the trajectories, how long it takes students to catch up academically. And this, what I'm showing you on the screen right now, are data from a reanalysis that I was able to do about 40 years ago of data from the Toronto board, where they had done a survey of 25% of the grade 5, 7, and 9 students in the board. And out of that number, there was about 1,200 students who had immigrated to Canada and who were learning English as an additional language. And so what you see in the graph is the data for those students. The LOR stands for length of residence. So the 3 data points down there for students who have LOR 1 are the data for students who've been in Canada for 1 year. LOR 3, they've been in Canada for 3 years, etc. AOA stands for age on arrival, and those are the ages that students arrived in Canada. The vertical axis is the data for picture vocabulary test. And what you see are essentially standard deviation units down the on that axis. So -1 there is the equivalent of 1 standard deviation, which would be 15 points on a standard scale like an IQ scale. So what you see here is that students who've been in Canada for just 1 year are about 1.5 standard deviations below the norm. Now, many of these students may have begun to use everyday language fairly fluently. They're beginning to understand much of what is said to them, but they're still very much beginners in the learning of academic English. So they're the equivalent of about 22, 23 standard score points. By 3 years length of residence, they're up to about -1 standard deviation. But for them to get within, to get close to grade expectations, which is the line up in the top there, we're looking at 5 to 7 years. Now, there's been lots of studies done since this in the United States, in Canada, in other parts of Canada, in Israel, in Europe, that have shown very similar patterns. So this has a lot of implications, because what it means is that if the mindset in the school is that the ESL teacher is the one who's responsible for newcomer students, she or he is the one who's going to help those students learn English, and then they can go into the regular class or be in the regular class, and we don't need to worry about their language skills or development. That mindset is going to leave a lot of students behind, because it's the regular classroom teacher who's going to have to provide the support for students in the context of their learning of academic language and academic subject matter. Because typically, in most provinces across Canada, students might get 1 year of ESL support, or maybe 2 years, depending on the situation. But after that, they're pretty much on their own in the classroom. And if the classroom teacher is not prepared, in both senses of the term prepared, if they don't have the knowledge and expertise to scaffold instruction, to provide ways of helping make content in science and math and other areas comprehensible for students, and also if they have a mindset that, well, this is not my job, somebody else should be doing this job, that's leaving the student out of the picture. So one of the themes that this implies is that we need to talk about a whole school response. We need to have coherent policies within the school where everybody realizes what their role is. So I'll move on to the second segment here. And this relates to the role of children's home languages. And I remember when I first started to work in this area, and when I came to Canada, to Toronto initially, it was quite common to hear stories of both teachers as well as psychologists, psychologists, for example, working at Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto, to advise immigrant parents that if they want their child to do okay in school, if they want them to get over whatever problems they're experiencing at this point in time, stop using that first language. That's confusing the students. Thankfully, that's behind us in most areas right now. The research has gotten through to policymakers and psychologists and others that that's an inappropriate piece of advice to give to parents. Because what the research is saying is that students' home languages represent important tools for thinking, they're crucial for communication within the family, and they're important for future economic and personal opportunities. And the research shows very clearly that when we're talking about academic language proficiencies, these are interdependent. There's a lot of overlap or interdependence across languages. And I've talked about a common underlying proficiency that makes possible two-way transfer across languages as students progress through the grades. Let me just share with you a couple of visual metaphors that tries to get across this idea. This is a double iceberg representation of bilingual proficiency. It's based on a metaphor that a sociolinguist, a person called Roger Shai, talked about back in the 70s. And I had the opportunity in the late 70s to be involved in a workshop with him, and we talked about this stuff. And he had talked about, basically in a monolingual context, language proficiency being kind of like an iceberg, where the obvious aspects of language, the fluency with which we speak, our accent, the kind of everyday language we use, that's what we pay attention to in most everyday contexts. But when it comes to learning in school, there are other aspects of language that are less obvious, less upfront, that we need to pay attention to. And these are sort of below the surface. And as everybody in Newfoundland knows much better than I do, or most other people around the world, what you see below the surface, or what's below the surface in an iceberg, has far more volume, far more mass than what's above the surface. And Roger Shai's point was that this has a lot of implications for how we teach. And then in discussion with him, I suggested, well, maybe we could think of bilingualism as a double iceberg, where even the surface aspect. Sorry, is somebody talking? Oh, sorry, okay. Okay, I hope I'm unmuted again now. The even though the surface aspects of the two languages are separate, there's a lot of interdependence across underneath that surface fluency. And this is why one of the findings that comes up over and over again is when we look at children becoming bilingual or multilingual, or when we look at French immersion programs, we find strong relationships between reading skills in students' first language and in their second language. Another visual metaphor, let's see, is comes from New Zealand. And this was a metaphor that a doctoral student, Sophie Tamati, suggested in relation to a particular kind of tree that grows only in New Zealand. It's the kahikatea tree. And this tree apparently grows in swampy, kind of waterlogged areas. And the way the trees develop their stability, their strength, is that the roots intertwine across multiple trees. So rather than just being one tree grounded with its roots in the ground, there are multiple trees that are providing additional strength. And so we can distinguish the trees. On the left, you can see that these are separate trees, but underneath, there's a lot of dynamism, there's a lot of connection, there's a lot of intersection. And her point is that language is like that. So the intertwining of the roots supports all trees to grow individually and collectively. And her point is that languages and multilingualism is like that. So the point here is that rather than trying to focus only on English, we should be communicating to children and to their parents that first language, and continuing to develop that first language, if it's possible, continuing to read in that first language, and use it with grandparents, with parents, is a powerful way of solidifying students' knowledge of academic skills in English. There's here just the various kinds of aspects of language that transfer. So concepts will transfer. If a student comes in who's had schooling, say grade 5 or grade 6, and they've already learned about photosynthesis in their home countries, they don't have to relearn that concept all over again. They have to learn how to talk about it in English. There's, again, other aspects of the language that transfer also. So we're talking about not just specific or narrow linguistic elements transferring, we're talking about the whole kind of conceptual apparatus and the learning strategies that we bring to the task of learning that will transfer across languages. Okay, moving on quickly to the third point that I want to make about literacy engagement. Let me just repeat the logic that is operating here. We find academic language primarily in printed text rather than in everyday conversation. So students' opportunities to broaden their vocabulary knowledge and develop strong reading comprehension skills are likely to be greatly enhanced when they have abundant access to printed texts and engage actively with these texts. Now, I think all teachers sort of intuitively know about this, but if you were to take a bird's eye view of elementary classrooms across the country, you'd probably find quite a bit of variation in the focus that teachers put on ensuring that all children have access to texts and are encouraged to read and talk about and dramatize texts as part of their everyday schooling. You know, one sad reality, particularly in the States, I think more than Canada, is that when school budgets get cut, one of the first people to go is the teacher librarian, because, okay, she or he is not teaching in an actual classroom. We can dispense with that role. And anyway, everything is on computers right now, so who needs books? Like, that mindset has been articulated frequently in a number of contexts. The reality is that the more students are reading, the stronger their academic language develops and the stronger they're going to do in content areas. And what a lot of educators and policymakers don't realize is this is not just sort of intuition. There's a ton of research that has been, to a considerable extent, neglected, pointing in this direction. So let's look at a couple of examples. The person you see on the screen right now is a cognitive psychologist called John Guthrie, who's been one of the principal people who has carried out research on reading engagement in particular, but also more broadly literacy engagement as being a crucial aspect in developing students' overall literacy skills. And when he talks about reading engagement or literacy engagement, he's talking about the amount and range of reading and writing, but also he's talking about the development of effective strategies for deep understanding of text. And this is something that a lot of kids who are reading extensively will sort of develop automatically. But for a lot of kids, having teachers focus in on these strategies is going to be really important. And then the affective side is really important. If students in the early years have not built up that affective connection to reading, if for them there's no real payoff in reading, if it's seen as a chore, it's going to be very difficult to get them into it later on. But the students who do well, regardless of what background they're coming from, are students who've been socialized into reading and enjoy reading, either because of what's been happening in the home or the kinds of instruction that they've got in the early years of schooling, where they really want to read. And there's a quote here from John Guthrie, where he's talking about large-scale research that's been carried out in the United States and international research carried out by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. And this research has shown repeatedly that students whose family background was characterized by low income and low education, and that may fit a lot of refugee students that we're working with. But so students whose family background was characterized by low income and low education, but who were highly engaged readers, substantially outscored students who came from backgrounds with higher education and higher income, but who themselves were less engaged readers. Based on a massive sample, this finding suggests the stunning conclusion that engaged reading can overcome traditional barriers to reading achievement, including gender, parental education, and income. I'll just go quickly through a couple of other things. You can look at them later on when you get the PowerPoint. This is a study that was carried out in New Zealand, where they looked at early childhood education centers, preschool programs, and looked at what was happening in these preschool programs that predicted long-term success in school. And one of the things that came out strongly from this work was the fact that the extent to which there was what they called print saturation in the preschool environment predicted how well students were reading at age 14 and age 16. Again, this highlights the fact that we need to start early. And so from the first day a child walks into school, whether it's at the kindergarten level or later, books should be part of the environment that we talk about, that we enjoy, that we share, and it becomes something that is particularly important for learners of English who are trying to catch up academically. And these learners of English have to run faster than the native English speaking students, because every year, native speaking students are increasing their vocabulary knowledge, they're increasing their reading skills, their reading comprehension, they're increasing their ability to write coherently in a variety of genres. And so in order to catch up, the second language learners have got to run faster in order to bridge that gap within 5 or 6 years. This is the OECD data, and they've produced consistent data over the past 20 years. If you look down at the bottom there, the second point, they showed that there was about a 1/3 overlap between the negative impact of social disadvantage, socioeconomic status, and that is related to achievement in most contexts around the world. Poverty matters for all kinds of reasons. But there was about a 1/3 overlap between the negative impact of socioeconomic status and the positive impact of reading engagement. In other words, what this means is that schools can potentially push back about 1/3 of the negative effects of low socioeconomic status by getting students actively engaged in reading and literacy more generally from a very early stage. Now, as Guthrie said, this is a stunning conclusion, and one that if we don't know about it, if school leaders, if school principals are not aware of this, then our priorities may wander away from focusing on students reading and making sure that this is part of our program and we emphasize it in all kinds of ways. This is an example here. This is a photograph from an elementary school fairly close to where I live in Toronto. And this school has about 94% of its students coming from non-English speaking backgrounds. They get some extra money because they're an inner city school. And one of the ways they spend this extra money is by keeping the school library open between 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 7 o'clock in the early evening, 4 days a week. So between Monday and Thursday, the school library stays open so that when parents come to pick up their children, they're invited, they're free to go into the school library, read books with their children, either in English or through the home language collection that they've got. They can check these books out to bring home. And this is exactly the kind of initiative that the research is implying. And so making sure that parents are aware of this reality and that they realize that encouraging students to listen to stories in the home language or read books in the home language, finding ways to share books amongst members of the same communities. This is a crucial way in which they can help their children succeed, because the first language literacy development that children are getting is going to transfer to English. Again, in the same school, I wandered around it one day and took photographs of things that were up on the wall. And outside one of the classrooms, I think it was a grade 5 classroom, they'd obviously been talking about, well, what's the point of reading? Why do we read? And the teacher had suggested this sentence starter, reading makes me powerful because, and then students filled it in. And then they displayed their insights or ideas. And this one says, reading makes me powerful because I get smarter and I learn more facts. I learn new words and I will never forget. All of which is very much consistent with what the research is saying. But notice what's happening here. The teacher is very skillfully linking up literacy with students' identities. If reading makes me powerful and it makes me smarter, then I want to do it. Another one by Tasneem. Tasneem wrote a lot. She had a lot to say. She said, reading makes me powerful because when I grow up, I can find a better job than people who can't read. Somebody can also trick you to do something that will get you into trouble. So in other words, if there's small print there in an agreement you've signed and you don't have the reading skills to read that small print, you can be tricked into being engaging in, or having somebody do something fraudulent to you. She goes on to say, reading gives you new words to learn. It gives my brain new ideas. It helps your vocabulary. So when you need to write something, you can use longer and harder words. In school, you can get a better mark using more words. Everything she's saying here is true. It's supported by research. It's also supported by common sense. I'm sure at this point, Tasneem is probably the CEO of some big multinational corporation, because she had everything figured out a long time ago. There are limits to how much we want to promote literacy engagement. Here's a picture of that I assume is made up of a child who took her literacy skills a little bit too far, but hopefully that won't happen. Okay, last point I want to make in terms of what the research is highlighting is identity issues. There's a quotation here from a very eminent African-American educator, Gloria Ladson-Billings, an article she wrote quite a while ago. But she said, the problem that African-American students face is the constant devaluation of their culture, both in school and in the larger society. And so when we look at what this means, if devaluation of identity is a factor, an important factor in students, the development of students' self-image and the extent to which they can feel confident engaging academically, then it follows that a major focus of what we do in schools has got to be to affirm students' identities. And for a variety of reasons, as I mentioned before, students coming in from refugee backgrounds or immigrant backgrounds are often vulnerable from multiple reasons that all of you are very much aware of. But what this means in terms of instructional responses is that we need to connect instruction to students' lives. We need to decolonize curriculum instruction. For example, if we're talking about Indigenous students, First Nations students who have been at the wrong end of coercive power relations in not just in Canada, but countries around the world, and that the whole education system has been historically a perpetuation of colonial racism, then within our schools, we need to decolonize curriculum. We need to affirm students' identities in association with literacy development and enable students to use their languages in powerful ways. So let me give you some examples of that. These can be just very simple ideas. In the Toronto board, the board will supply signs for the office to be put at the entrance of the school in up to 10 languages, and the schools can specify which languages they want. And so this is a very small thing, costs practically no additional money. But what it does for students and their parents is every time they walk into the school, they're getting affirmation that their language is being recognized and their language matters. Small point, but potentially powerful. The same school, walking around the corridors, there were examples of students' work in multiple languages. This here's the student was from a Spanish-speaking background, and the school had during this period was focusing on character development, and so they were talking about emotions like empathy, and this student talks about what empathy means in Spanish, and it's there, it's displayed, and it's articulating the fact that this is not just an English zone school, other languages are welcome also. An example from a grade 4 ESL class, the teacher Sad in Thornwood Public School near Toronto. And he had his students who came from multiple backgrounds, but there were clusters of stuff, 4 or 5 students in particular groups. He had his students look at how their home language and English are alike and different. And so the students discussed this, they carried out research, they probably asked their parents about some of the features of Arabic, and they came up with examples of how the 2 languages connect together. This is reinforcing students' awareness of how language works. It's alerting students to ways in which their first language is similar or different from English, but it's also validating the fact that their first language is something that gives them the opportunity to carry out this kind of work, and it's important. Dual language books are something that is a really good example of how we can engage students' multilingual repertoires. This is a story written by a grade 6 student, Tomer Shahar. He was in his first year of learning English. His teacher was Lisa Leone, and Lisa wanted to make sure that she was covering the curriculum objectives for grade 6. The fact that students were early stage learners of English didn't matter. They had the cognitive skills to engage with these issues. And the problem was, if she was to follow the writing guidelines for grade 6, students wouldn't be able to do very much in English. So she invited students and encouraged them to write in their first language. And then she found ways to help students go from that first language to English. In this case, there was a teacher in the school who spoke enough Hebrew to help Tomer translate his story into Hebrew, and they did the translation collaboratively. And then the result is a dual language book that's up on the web. It's been read by thousands of people. And Tomer has, I think, some really insightful comments on this process. He says, I think using your first language is so helpful because when you don't understand something after you've just come here, it's like beginning as a baby. You don't know English and you need to learn it all from the beginning. But if you already have it in another language, then it's easier. You can translate it and you can do it in your language too. And then it's easier to understand the second language. Like, this is probably a much more comprehensible way of talking about that double iceberg diagram. That language knowledge transfers across the two languages. This two-way transfer when both languages are emphasized. And it's a win-win situation. And notice what he says, like, when you don't understand something after you've just come here, it's like beginning as a baby. That's an identity statement. And for a 12-year-old girl or boy in a new society, feeling like they're a baby is not a very affirmative feeling. But when it comes to what he did, he was able to showcase his literacy in two languages. His story was read by all the other students in the class in English. He posted he connected with his friends back in Israel and say, go to the website, my story's up there. They read the story in Israel in Hebrew. And so you're looking at multiple benefits to this kind of work. Tomer goes on to say, the first time I couldn't understand what Lisa was saying, except the word Hebrew, but I think it's very smart that you said for us to do it in our language, because we can't just sit in our hands doing nothing. And so allowing students and encouraging students to bring their first language into the classroom is a really good way of ensuring that they're not just sitting on their hands, being well-behaved, but doing nothing. And again, the mainstream classroom teacher needs to understand this just as much as the ESL teacher. I'm going to, just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through this other one. It's a dual language book written by 3 students from Pakistan, Mediha, Sulmana, and Kanta. Again, the teacher was Lisa Leone. It was a different year. These were grade 7 students. But Mediha and Sulmana had been in Canada for about 3.5 years, and their English was pretty fluent. But sorry, Sulmana and Kanta had been in Canada for 3.5 years and were fairly fluent in English. But Mediha had just arrived about 6 weeks before they started this project. And if you think about Mediha in a typical classroom, typical ESL classroom, where you've got it's seen as an English-only zone. The first language is not seen as something that can be brought in. With a writing project like this, you might get 2 or 3 painful sentences from her. But when the rules of the game are changed, when the teacher encouraged them to read, to write in their first language, and then work from that first language to English, they a whole new universe opened up for students. I'm not going to show you the video because I think it probably won't work on Zoom, but Candace's perspective is really interesting. This was a part of a talk that she gave at a TESL conference a few years back in Toronto with her teacher and with the other students. She says, how it helped me was when I came here in grade 4, the teachers didn't know what I was capable of. I was given a pack of crayons and a coloring book and told to get on coloring with it. And after I felt so bad about that, I'm capable of doing much more than just that. I have my own inner skills to show the world other than just coloring. And I felt that those skills of mine are important also. So when we started writing the book, I could actually show the world that I am something instead of just coloring. And that's how it helped me. And it made me so proud of myself that I'm actually capable of doing something. And here today, I'm actually doing something. I'm not just a coloring person. I can show you that I am something. I think this expresses quite powerfully the role of identity in learning and the inadvertent messages that we can sometimes give students when we treat them only as ESL learners, and when we don't realize that they are resilient, creative, vibrant people who need to be given the opportunity to have their voices heard. And there's no off-the-shelf rules for doing this. We've got to talk about it within the school context and share our experiences. This work was not something that I suggested that teachers do. This work was a teacher's initiative. Lisa Leone, the teacher, was a knowledge generator in this context. And I think if we see ourselves individually and collectively as knowledge generators, we'll find ways of addressing problems that children may be having and maybe turning those problems into opportunities. Another example, a grade 5 teacher, Tobin Zikmanis in Thornwood Public School, was teaching a data management unit. And again, this is a school with more than 80% of the students from non-English speaking backgrounds. Rather than just use the suggestions in the textbook, Tobin had his students carry out a survey of the entire school. It was a kindergarten to grade 5 school. And he broke students up into groups, and each group of 3 or 4 students took a different grade level. And they developed 3 questions that they asked the students, with the help of the teachers. And then they used that data that they'd collected about the languages spoken in the school as the input for their data management. So they poured all of this data into a spreadsheet program and churned out pie graphs, bar graphs. They talked about it. And Tobin talks about the fact that he couldn't get students to go out for recess because they were so engaged with this project. So again, this didn't involve using other languages directly, but in terms of connecting to students' lives, it was powerful. Students were finding out about themselves. I'll just give you one more example. And this is a project that was carried out in a school within a school. It's a First Nations mini school that was within a high school in the Hamilton area, south of Toronto. And the school arranged for an Ojibwe artist, Rene Mishake, you can see him over on the right, to work with the students on art and cultural projects, and for over a period of a couple of months. And the students created paintings. You can see one of them in the middle there, the eagle kind of rising up. And they drew on their cultural knowledge as they created these stories, and they drew on their identities. And then they reacted to each other's stories, some of them just in prose, some of them wrote poems to express their reactions. And I'd like to share with you the comments of one of these students, Cassandra, whom you see in the left. She says, "This experience gave me a gift of poetry. I started to develop a passion for poetry during this project. I didn't know I had this passion. Since this project, I've written and shared many pieces of poetry. Participating in this project was like hearing a collective voice telling me, we're proud of you, we care about you, you have a future. Being able to express my thoughts about who I am as an Ojibwe woman made me feel like I belonged and was connected to a larger community. Here she talks, this was, that was what she wrote there, was what she talked about in an article that was written with the two researchers involved and two of the students. But here, this is on video. And she says, she's talking about identity and its importance. She says, take away identity and what do you have? If you have a student that doesn't know who they are, do you think they care about what goes on in the classroom? So again, affirming identity is incredibly important, and we need to talk about it within our schools. So if we look at what's happening in these examples of multilingual pedagogy, there's a list here that I'm not going to go through it because of time, but you can take a look at it later. But there's multiple benefits instructionally and from a learning point of view in acknowledging that students' home languages have a role to play in their learning. I'm not going to get into Binogi, but as I said, I would encourage you to take a look at it because there may be examples in there that you can use within your classrooms, and much of it is free for teachers to get into. I'll give you one of just, you can see some of the screenshots from it here. This was a unit in fractions. There's typically about 5-minute animated videos that explain the concept. These are some of the math examples that they've got. Students can choose the spoken language and the subtitles, and obviously not all languages are included, but some of the languages of refugee students were highlighted or prioritized in terms of becoming available within the program. This is just some of the physics content that they've got. So you can see there's a lot of material in there that's worth exploring. Let me just kind of wrap up with another experience that was quite personal. A friend of mine, somebody whose doctoral work I was involved in the 1990s, spent a year with her 14-year-old son, Nito, over this past year. She wanted Nito to have the experience of attending a Canadian school and being immersed in English. And so he spent his grade 9 year attending the Toronto District School Board. And his English skills were intermediate. He could communicate reasonably well, but his writing needed some work, not surprisingly. So when the pandemic arrived, all TDSB classes went online, but the results were somewhat haphazard. In Nito's case, there was minimal online contact with the teacher or with other students in the class. So he felt quite isolated. And his mother asked our two sons, Thomas and Stephen, if they would provide some online English tutoring for him. And she was also an ESL or EFL researcher in Japan. And she developed some lesson plans based on some Japanese English textbooks. And I knew immediately that these would be very difficult to implement online. In fact, I thought it would be a disaster to try and do this because they're teacher-centered, focused on grammatical points, etc. And for Nito to engage, she had to be involved in choosing topics that interested him. And so we discussed some options and came up with a structure whereby Nito would research TED Talks that were of interest to him. He was passionate about basketball, like rap music, etc. So he, possibly with the help of his mother, researched these talks. He could read the content in Japanese. The transcripts were there. There was also subtitles in Japanese. So he could listen to the talks in English, but they were accessible to him because of the Japanese support. And then he wrote in English a one-page response to the talk, which he would send to Stephen or Thomas at least a day before they met online. When they met online about once a week, they would first discuss the topic, and then Stephen or Thomas would provide feedback and corrections to what he had written. This is just an anecdote, but the experience of Nito was that he thought his writing had improved very significantly as a result of this. And it highlights just the kinds of things that are out there if we explore what's possible. And for students to engage, the content needs to be of interest to them. And it doesn't matter whether Nito is listening to some TED talk about basketball, which is not on the school curriculum, as far as I know, or rap music, which also is probably not on the school curriculum. They're listening to English, they're expanding their vocabulary, and that's what's going to be important. And so this example, I think, highlights the fact that you've got listening, you've got writing in English happening with the support of the first language. And I want to just, I'll wrap up with an anecdote that comes from a wonderful book that Stephen Krashen wrote called The Power of Reading. And he came across a column from Ann Landers. Some of us who are older will remember Ann Landers. This was a column in 1976. She was the kind of advice columnist that was probably best known around the world. And Steve uses this as an example of how writing is powerful to get students engaged in, not just for language learning and language expansion, but for problem solving. And so the letter goes like this. Dear Anne, I'm a 26-year-old woman, and I feel like a fool asking you this question, but should I marry the guy or not? Jerry is 30, but sometimes he acts like 14. Jerry's a salesman and makes good money, but he has lost his wallet 3 times since I've known him, and I've had to help him meet the payments on his car. The thing that bothers me most, I think, is that I have the feeling he doesn't trust me. After every date, he telephones. He says it's to say an extra good night, but I'm sure he's checking to see if I had a late date with someone else. It goes on. One night I was in the shower and didn't hear the phone. He came over and sat on the porch all night. I found him asleep on the swing when I went to get the paper the next morning at 6:30 in the morning. I had a hard time convincing him I had been in the house the whole time. Now, on the plus side, Jerry is very good looking and appeals to me physically. Well, that does it. I've been sitting here with this pen in my hand for 15 minutes, trying to think of something else good to say about him, and nothing comes to mind. Don't bother to answer this. You've helped me more than you will ever know. Anyway, I think that is a kind of a nice reminder about how useful writing can be. It's tough to get kids writing often, but if we can, it really powers their academic learning in English. So I'll stop there and thank you for the opportunity to be here. And if we've got some time for questions, I'd be really happy to try and answer.
Thank you very much, Jim. Just like during your long storied teaching career at OISE, this morning you have kept the English language learner at the heart of your presentation, and you have also affirmed and strengthened all of us in the process. Thank you so much. Now I will look at the chat room and see what questions we have here. I'm seeing lots of thank yous. Are there any questions? Well, Jim, I have one for you. We're still confronted at times in Newfoundland with administrators creating classes for ESL teachers and Learn teachers based on grade level. What do you think is the best approach to convince educators that we really need to have ability-based groupings?
I guess talk to them. Basically, administrators, for the most part, I'm not talking about Newfoundland because I know nothing about the administrators in Newfoundland, but if I think about school principals and vice principals in the Ontario area and across the country in places where I've been, frequently they've had very little opportunity to acquire the knowledge base that exists regarding what makes sense for English language learners. And so they're operating on intuition. And I think there needs to be a discussion of, okay, what's in the best interest of students? What are the realities? And I think finding ways to help administrators gain access to that information, talk about the particular context that the school is in, um, that's important, because if grade-based classes are not likely to be the best alternative, and in most cases they're not going to be the best alternative, because you've got huge variation even like within grades, and so um, if the ESL and Learn teachers within the school talk about, okay, who are our students, what kinds of needs do they have, what are the issues that we need to help them with, then talking with the administrators about this and your rationale for suggesting particular kinds of organization that will work for your students in your context makes sense. There's got to be dialogue. And for the most part, Learn teachers and ESL teachers have far more knowledge of these issues than administrators are likely to have. And so keeping those lines open, I think, is really useful in terms of trying to help administrators understand what the issues are, but also to think in terms of not just the ESL or Learn support, but what's happening in the entire school. Are there ways in which we can increase the social contact between newcomer students and the entire school? What are we doing in sports teams? Would it make sense to have other kinds of activities, like say a chess club, where you don't need very much language to do, but there's no reason why newcomer students or ESL students shouldn't be as good as anybody else in chess. So you need to kind of talk about the entire ecosystem of the school in terms of how can we increase contact, how can we reduce isolation, how can we provide the learning opportunities that students need according to where they are and what their needs are. So it's there isn't a right answer to this, but figuring out what works in the particular context that you're in is something that'll happen through dialogue. And hopefully there's a situation where you don't have a kind of a top-down, my way or the doorway type of orientation. In most contexts, I think you don't. Administrators are anxious to learn more about these issues, but talking with them and trying to find common ground will, I think, reap benefits in most cases.
Thank you, Jim. That's very informative and gives me a lot of direction. I'm going to ask Melissa Enns Delgado to please ask her question.
Hi, I have a question about, I work at an academic prep school, and so I work in an ESL department of 8 people, and then our goal is to prepare students academically and send them into mainstream classes. But I'm curious if you have any tips for garnering buy-in from teachers who are not in the EAL department in terms of their role in affirming English language learners' identities, and also their importance in continuing to scaffold their learning of academic language even when they've graduated from the EAL program. It's a bit of a challenge in our school, so I would definitely like to hear any advice you have.
Okay, thanks, Melissa. That's a great question, and one that's not specific to Newfoundland and Labrador. It's like, this is an issue right across the country. It's an issue in the United States. It's an issue in Europe. And what speaks to me from what you've said is the fact that there isn't a leadership operating in the school that has made it clear that all teachers are teachers of language. All teachers need to teach students according to where they're at. And this is much more of a challenge, I think, at the secondary level rather than at the elementary level. Because at the elementary level, the same teacher is teaching across the curriculum. At the high school level, teachers typically are teaching particular subject areas. And the attitude often is, well, it's not my job to teach these kids language. Somebody else should do it. If the ESL teachers were doing their job properly, I wouldn't have to deal with this. And I'm not going to lower my standards. So like these are kind of reactions that are very, very common. I think ideally what should be happening in the school context that you're talking about is that the administrators in the school should be initiating dialogue about what is our school philosophy with respect to providing support for students who are learning the language, and raise the question, like, is this an issue for just for the ESL teacher? What can an ESL teacher do realistically within 1 year, say? And what are the trajectories? And we know, like from what I talked about earlier on, we know, and this is not disputed by anybody, there will be individual variation here, but typically we're looking at least 5 years for newcomer students to catch up academically. And at the secondary level, it may be even more because there's further to go. And so having that conversation at the school level and the school principal or administrators basically saying, look, this is the reality. We don't choose the students that come into our class. It would be great if we had every student in our class totally fluent in English and with IQs of 150. That would make our jobs a lot easier. The reality is we've got to teach the students that we have. And this means that we need to understand how language is integrated with every subject area. Like when you're teaching science, you're not just teaching science, you're teaching the language of science. Photosynthesis is a word. And we can reinforce kids' knowledge of how language works in the science class. So if we have a word like, if we're talking about motion and we talk about accelerate and acceleration, well, that's a good opportunity for the science teacher to say, well, this structure where we have words ending in T-I-O-N, what do we know about this? And what other words do you know that end in T-I-O-N? Like fluctuation, now, whatever it might be. And so alerting students to the fact that there are patterns in the language, and most of the language of academic content, the tier 2 vocabulary and the technical tier 3 vocabulary, they come from Latin and Greek sources. And they have particular patterns, they have prefixes, they have roots, and they have suffixes. And this is not something that students can learn immediately. They learn them in the context of learning academic content. So in mathematics, if you're talking about multiplication, subtraction, all of these TION words, as soon as a student sees one of those words, he or she should know, okay, this is an abstract noun. Let me look at the first part of the word. And maybe I know the word subtract, but I've never come across subtraction. So getting that message across to the entire school and coming up with a language policy or language plan that everybody buys into is a crucial first step. And this stuff, it's not that complicated. It's maybe taking teachers out of their comfort zone initially, or mainstream classroom teachers. But if they realize that this is what their students need if they're going to succeed in math or science or history or whatever it might be, then that's going to motivate them to be more aware of the central role of language in everything that they do, and to think twice before reducing a student's grade level because there are a few grammatical mistakes or a few word choices that are not right. Those, if you want to kill a student's motivation, do that. If you want students to disengage and stop making an effort, that's going to happen. And sometimes all it needs is for us to shine a light on that, and the penny drops, and teachers say, well, I never thought about that. So get that conversation going at the school, talk to administrators so you've got their support. But I've been saying the same thing for probably 30 years or so, and with minimal impact. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's got to be something that school principals buy into. And if I can just add one more thing, if we look at who becomes a school principal, what are the criteria for seeing somebody as being a leader in a school? In a context like Newfoundland, where there's an increasing number of diverse learners, it seems very obvious to me that school leaders should know how to lead in schools where there are a considerable number of kids learning the school language. And if they know nothing about the research, relating to that, they're not in a position to lead. And you know, if I were to take a bird's eye view of Ontario, which has a far greater proportion of kids learning English as an additional language, my guess is that probably 50% of administrators, school administrators, have had no background and know very little about issues related to ESL learners. You know, whether, and you know, that's a failure not just of those individual principals, they haven't had the opportunity, nobody's told them it's important. It's certainly a failure of leadership in the board as a whole. It's a failure of leadership in the province as a whole, that it doesn't ensure that one of the essential knowledges that school leaders should have is how to support students who are learning the school language, and how to mobilize the teachers so that everybody buys into the fact that teaching ESL is everybody's business, not just the language specialist.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Jim.